Hello, everyone. I'm Brent Steele of the University of Utah.
Hi there, I'm Dr. Xander Kirke. I'm Assistant Professor International Relations at Northumberland University.
And we are here today to talk to you about our forthcoming article, or by the time this is being viewed, our published article, Ontological Security, Myth and Existentialism. And it is part of the special issue that's edited by Andrew R. Hom and Cian O'Driscoll on existentialism and international relations up to our necks. And so this is a video abstract for us to share with you very hopefully succinctly, but also substantively, the overview of our article. So our article goes through, in short, three purposes and three sections. The overarching purpose is to investigate the overlapping terrain of myth and ontological security. Myth is something that Xander has been working on for some time in his career and in his research program. He's also done a little bit of work on ontological security. Ontological security is something that I've been working on within the research community of ontological security studies. And so we're combining that in the context of existentialism and the contributions to this special issue. We proceed through three sections. We focus on describing the relationship between anxiety and myth, how the absolutism of reality, which Xander is going to talk about here in a second, is avoided through myth. The second section discusses myth and narrative and some insights that myth may have for narratives, which are important devices in the context of creating ontological security, and they're an important referent in ontological security studies. And our third and concluding section, along with our conclusion, is sort of, for lack of a better term, a political call to action, the way in which you can channel anxiety towards political action via myth. So not just sitting back and managing anxiety, but using it for possibly even progressive forms of political action. I'll turn it over to Xander now to talk about the next few aspects of our article.
Hi there. So a key concept we use throughout the article is the notion of the absolutism of reality. And this is a concept that we find in particular from the works of Hans Blumenberg, who was a philosophical anthropologist in the 20th century. So what is the absolutism of reality? Well, to put it kind of simply, really, if you imagine a situation in the world where everything is happening at once, and all of this is pretty much indifferent to your existence. It doesn't matter whether you, what you perceive yourself as, how you'd relate to others. And you had no names for these concepts. There was no way of filtering and organizing the world. It would be a very, should we say, anxiety-inducing experience. It's for people like Blumenberg and others, quite a terrifying state potentially to be in, were it to actually happen. Now, if we think of the world like this, as this being a possibility of our existence, what we need is to find a sense of grounding within the world. That might be through naming, it might be through stories, it could be through even science, perhaps, music, culture, different ways of filtering these difficulties that would otherwise be somewhat paralyzing to our existence. And in fact, there are other German anthropologists in particular, like Arnold Gehlen, who would say that this is kind of almost a weakness of us. We're so adaptable to different conditions that we can find ourselves being somewhat prone to being overwhelmed in all the different environments we can potentially find ourselves. So what Blumenberg argues, drawing from Erich Rothhacker, is that we need a sense of grounding within the world, in which he sees as significance. And this isn't just finding meaning, so to speak, because there's meaning wherever there's language. And in fact, if you think of a mathematical symbol, it has meaning, but does it really ground that sense of significance for us? And what it allows us to do, grounding a sense of significance, is answer the questions that would be, if you like, between life and death. So the things which matter to us within the world, and to manage and in some senses avoid the chaos that we'd otherwise experience in the world, while paradoxically also allowing us to live within it. So in a sense, we're trying to avoid the absolutism of reality or the negative consequences of it. Next slide, please. One way in which we avoid the absolutism of reality or ground a sense of significance within the world is through myths. Myths, if you think in the classical mythological sense, are often ways in which we cope and explain phenomena within the world. But myths are very much a part of our politics now in the present day. There's an assumption among many, and this actually includes some scholarship, especially in the 19th century, which assumes that the logos, if you like, has overcome the mythos. So scientific rationality overcomes myth, it disproves things. This is in large part refuted in different aspects of myth scholarship, but particularly the more existentialist variety of myth, broadly conceived. So what do we mean by myths? Well, first of all, they are to some extent narratives. They're often dramatic, highly figurative. They'll contain themes such as tragedy, joy, glorious memories, foundation myths especially you might think of, future promises of victory. They essentially ask you to almost be a part of it. They try and push forward and explain the difficulties and the need for significance that we otherwise would have. And in fact, they are very good at providing this sense of significance. They may seem rational and explanatory and may not necessarily be irrational, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the main issue. What matters is what they do. Do they provide the sense of significance? Can they offer an explanatory power through drama, through storytelling, through encouraging active participation within an ongoing story? And this is why we often refer to them as processes. So by this, we mean what Blumenberg and Kirke more recently argue is the work on myth. So the fact that it's constantly changing and adapting to suit present circumstances. So a myth may not be particularly interesting to you if it's about a subject that doesn't interest you, or is a foundational myth for a country you have no connection with. That's one possible example. But what matters really is not necessarily whether they're accurate or not, but whether they provide us with the grounding to avoid the ambiguities of politics, because politics is complicated. There are a lot of different interpretations of politics. There's a lot of complicated processes. If you can simplify it, and that's really key, if you can simplify it, myth is a superb tool almost to be able to do that. And I think this is perhaps one thing that's particularly key in the works of Blumenberg, when he argues, and I think this is really important, the myths are stories that is distinguished by a high degree of constancy in their narrative core and an equally pronounced capacity for marginal variation. Now, he's not necessarily talking about political myths. He looks at the myth of Prometheus as one example, but it's a fact that there is a narrative core. So it may be, say, in the United States, foundational myths about what the US is, but you then apply them into very contemporary examples, what it means, say, to act against, just one example off the top of my head, say, against terrorism. Just one example, you see in discourse narratives, plenty of stuff about myth there. Next slide, please. So we have looked then at myth and the existential variety of myth, because this is what we're talking about, really. We're talking about, in some respects, the themes of anxiety and existentialism. And this is really the same kind of thing that ontological security would look at least in principle. But there are some key differences, really. Now, we know that ontological security studies has looked at different types of security that can be generated by what you mean ontological security. And quite commonly, you may look back at people like Anthony Giddens, who talks about routinized practices, and being able to function, I guess, within the world. And often this requires us to have an element of consistency. With the existentialist approach to myth, what it allows us to do is particularly augment or improve our understanding of the more dramatic aspects of myth, the way it encourages people to calls for action, and how they go beyond just narratives by adding this existential dimension, this narrative that provides us with significance. So there are a lot of narratives. You see electoral slogans that are narratives technically, but do they really add this dimension that enables us to live more comfortably within the world? I would argue, I think we would probably argue, no, not necessarily. Myths add that extra dimension. That's key to the existential notion. Now, one of the problems with myth is that on the one hand, you might think of myth as something which we can just refute. Say, well, that's wrong. This is correct. But myths have this amazing tendency to simplify politics. Things become very straightforward. And we really see this in populism with basic mythologies of the elite versus the people, or connecting these quite often to foundation myths or whatever. These things matter because they are so foundational to how people read and interpret the world, because there are obviously, without going too deep into the kind of epistemological and ontological assumptions here, there are different ways of reading and interpreting the world. What myths do, and particularly through similar things like George Sorel would have pointed out, where you need to mobilize the working classes to overthrow the bourgeoisie, because changes don't necessarily happen just through rational means by reading, but by action. What myths do is encourage people into this form of action. And we really saw this, we would argue, during the COVID pandemic, and particularly among COVID denialism. And you saw over and over again, despite overwhelming evidence that COVID was kind of a problem that we all experienced, that people would still deny it regardless of evidence, because there was a genuine conspiracy myth quite often, or that this was just another attempt at establishment at control. And indeed, attempts to rationalize this and counter it with rationality were often looked upon with extreme disdain. One example we bring up is, say, Donald Trump and the Fire Fauci movement, the chief medical officer in the United States. And of course, in line with Browning here, this means that we are seeing through myth the potential to channel anxiety into political action. And this provides us, we think, with a very nice bridge between the existentialist aspects that we find in people like Newmanberg, among others, and myth and ontological security. Next.
Okay, so that is our article right there in a nutshell. And where Xander just concluded in our presentation is where we conclude in the article as well. We give some examples of some, for lack of a better term, progressive myths that are out there in political calls to action in the form of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has just been has been analyzed quite a bit over the last few years, and was just showcased in a study by Ty Solomon, who's also done work on existentialism and ontological security studies. And so we use that as an example of the ways in which anxiety, both existential anxiety for some, ethical anxiety, which is another concept that we discuss a little bit in this article as well, and pops up in ontological security studies for others, can be channeled, as Xander was just saying, towards forms of political action that don't just resist the violent ordering of others, but also represent attempts at reordering. So in slight contrast to some of the critiques of ontological security studies that we've seen by very important ones by Chris Rossdale and others about the concerns over order, preventing justice, we actually think that it's not quite time yet to give up on the possibility of ordering. And through myth and calls to political action, there can be forms of solidarity that develop that allow for a reordering into societies that not only are forms of order, but represent more just forms of order going forward. And that's kind of where we end our article. So with that, we wanted to just thank the editors, Review of International Studies, for their work on our manuscript, the reviewers that we had who were very helpful in terms of pointing out some opportunities for development and sharpening of the argument, Leanne Hartnett, who got the existentialism project in international relations going over the last few years, especially during COVID. So a lot of these meetings had to happen over Zoom, and we really appreciate Leanne's work towards that end. And then, of course, Andy Hom and Kean O'Driscoll, who are our special issue editors for this. And I wanted to thank Xander because he is an inspiring co-author to have as an early career researcher himself. And he's someone that kind of kept me going throughout the pandemic on this topic, and reminded me that there's more important things than just higher ed administration and some of the other mundane things that happen on a daily basis. So I wanted to thank him. He's a wonderful co-author to have. So
yeah, I would also love to extend a thank you to you, Brent, for giving me the opportunity to work with yourself, being such a distinguished scholar, and I've learned a huge amount from writing with you. It's been an absolute pleasure, and let's see where this goes. Let's see the reaction to this, and maybe there'll be a collaboration again in future.
that sounds good. And thanks to Chrissy Dux and Ellie Phillips for editing this and for their work on producing this video abstract and all the work they do for BISA and the Review of International Studies. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you.